Edfu temple, there are special scenes that describe the struggle between god Horus, the god of good, and god Set, the god of evil. These scenes are described on that wall. Actually, it was a very big festival called the Festival of the Victory of Horus. Each king wanted to guarantee that he can bequeath the throne to his son, just like Horus inherited the throne of the living gods from his father, god Osiris. So a theater or a stage was set here in Edfu temple, over which this play on the wall was really acted. So the scenes start actually from here, when god Jehuti or god Ibis read from a piece of paper. Now we are going to start the play of the struggle of Horus with his uncle god Set. And the story starts with god Horus standing on a boat sailing in the Nile, assisted with his mother, by his mother goddess Isis, and behind him is the Ptolemy king. And then the story is going to continue in that direction, with god Set here represented as a hippo under the bows and the arrows of god Horus. So the story actually continues in this direction. Theater has started in Egypt before it did in any other country or part of the world. It was set in the open court of temples, where as many audience as possible could come on special festivals and watch plays acted on stages that were built specially for each occasion. These plays told the mythologies of the past, for history was extremely important for the ancient Egyptians, and nothing could have been better than learning it through the art of acting in the most exciting way. The walls of Edfu temple record part of the famous mythology of the struggle between god Horus and god Set, which is one of the most ancient and important religious mythologies the ancient Egyptian civilization ever knew, and that's clear by being referred to in literary and funerary sources across ages. This mythology is connected with the eternal struggle between good and evil, and it was also related to eternal and cosmic events with very old historical roots that were connected with the formation and legitimacy of royalty in ancient Egypt. It was connected to Osiris mythology, but it was more ancient, for it reflects a side of the political struggle or competition during the pre-dynastic era between the leaders of Lower Egypt, who were fighting under the protection of their god Horus, and the leaders of Upper Egypt, who were protected by their god Set, the lord of Nobit city in South Egypt. At one stage of that struggle, the people of the north succeeded in heading south, where they succeeded in controlling the whole country, and the two halves of the country were united, and Horus was taken as an official deity for Egypt. It's important to point out that the king's annual records throughout the historical ages had mentioned that the leaders of the pre-dynastic period were known as Shamsu Hur, which means the followers of Horus. The priests of Beh and the spirits of Nekhen were also called Shamsu Hur. They were considered the old kings of these two cities, which represent the kingdoms of the north and the south. That's a proof that god Horus was collateral to the political life of the country since these ages. In Turin Papyrus, a text mentions that gods ruled the earth for a period which ended with the ruling of the inheritants of the throne of Geb. From that time, the kings throughout ages were considered successors of Horus on earth, when the ruling king got united with Horus, while the deceased king was united with his father Osiris. Both Horus and Set acquired an important level in both the Egyptian creeds and the political affairs, and they were both worshipped and sanctified. In addition, they played an important role in the sun god's daily journey within the crew of his boat, as it's clear in the Book of the Imidwat and the Book of the Gates, and other religious books. Of what the mythology has pictured about the permanent struggle between Horus and Set, about the worthy of each of them to the throne, they were both sponsors of royalty. The name Horus was associated with the person and the title of the king throughout the entire Egyptian history, for the king is the representative of Horus on earth. Set also has occupied a precedent position, being the formal god of the country during some periods of the history, and in other times he shared this position with Horus. Since the early dynasties, the reliefs and scenes embodied the victory of Horus, for the falcon Horus was pictured on armor stele, dragging the heads of the enemies with a rope, in addition to picturing him above the facade of the palace or the serech throughout the whole period of the first dynasty. Then came King Per-Ibsen from the second dynasty and replaced Horus with Set, until Ha-Sekhemwy placed them both above the serech. Both deities were equal partners or opponents and protectors of monarchy, for they compete and get together and break up, and Horus represented legitimacy, while Set symbolized chaos and illegitimacy. Many scenes showed them together during some rituals or festivals, including the coronation of the king, where they stabilized the crown above his head. Among these scenes are the ones that represent the coronation of King Ramses II, which was pictured on the walls of the small temple of Abu Simbel, and it seems that during performing the actual rituals, two of the high priests reincarnate the roles of Horus and Set. It seems that the struggle between Horus and Set was inevitable, so that the balance of power in the universe could be sustained, as since the first dynasty, the king was supposed to have derived his power and throne from both masters. Many sources has referred to this struggle. The oldest of these indications are in the Pyramids texts and the Coffins texts and the Book of the Dead, in addition to the Fourth Papyrus of Lahun from the Middle Kingdom written in Hieratic, and the Fourth Papyrus of Salye, and the Stela of King Shibaka from the 25th dynasty. According to the mythology, a fearful fight occurred between Horus and Set and resulted in the gouging out of the eye of Horus. God Jehweti or Thoth became responsible for restoring the Ujat eye and its healing, which is the injured eye of Horus, which represents the moon. The consequence of that injury was that darkness fell on earth. That symbolizes the wane of the moon at the end of the month. At the same time, the healing process of the eye done by Thoth represents the grading cycle of the moon reaching the full moon, which embodies the completeness of the healing of Horus' eye. From here came the role of Thoth as a god of the moon. In many scenes he was pictured healing the Ujat eye and returning it back to its ordinary form. papyrus of the 4th Lahun tells that the struggle between Horus and Set has started when Horus was a juvenile, at a time when Isis was looking after him and protecting him from Set, using her great capability of magic. Amongst the important sources that tackle the struggle between Horus and Set is that famous papyrus that goes back to the time of King Ramesses V from the 20th century, written in Hieratic and known as Papyrus Chester Beatty I, and is kept in Dublin Museum. It seems that this papyrus was copied from a more ancient period, maybe the Middle Kingdom. It has told the many stages of struggle that went on between them and lasted for 80 years. A part of the story, God Set, who is supposed to be the god of evil, represented as a hippo, turned to be a pig so that he can escape from God Horus over land instead of escaping in the water. After that, he's going to continue running from him, and God Horus, he will leave the boat and go over land and chase God Set, with the help all the time of his mother, goddess Isis, and the Ptolemaic or the Greek king assisting him on the back of the boat, and then the story continues. If we went through the most important parts of Chester Beatty I, which is considered the main reference of that struggle, we find that when Horus became mature, he started to claim his legitimate right to his father's inheritance against his uncle Set, the throne usurper, who claimed he was more deserving, being the strongest and the protector of gods. Here, Horus was described as a juvenile and tiny, but clever, while Set was described as a strong and a gigantic, but easy to deceive. In this part of the struggle between God Horus and God Set in Edfu Temple, we can see that God Horus, falcon god, finally succeeded in capturing God Set, who is represented here as a hippo, by putting the arrow in his head and capturing his feet, front feet and back feet, and his legs by the ropes, assisted by his mother goddess Isis, kneeling down on the front of the boat, and her crown is above her, telling her name. So this is a very crucial part in the story of the struggle, because here the good overcome the evil, and God Set is going to lose his war in that struggle. But that's not the end of the story. The cause has lasted 8 years. The struggle happened during that period, but was intervened by truce periods, in which some schemes were planned by both sides, each trying to set up and get the other. Isis appeared here to support her son and stood by him in front of the gods' congregation, and used her magic to topple Set in all ways and get his confession of his assault of her husband and son. It's noticeable at this point that other gods supported Horus and stood by him, especially Gacho and God Thoth, for they stood against the alignment of the greatest god Ra, who sided with Set, cause he is the strongest, and stands at the front of the million of years boat to defend the sun god's boat and destroy the eternal enemy Apophis. During the heat of the events, Set swore to throw the throne in the water, and asked Horus to turn into hippos and dive in the sea, and the one who comes out would lose the position. Then they dived. Isis cried and threw a rope with a copper hook to rescue her son. When it caught Set, he called for his sister's help, so she let him go. Horus got upset and came out of the water and decapitated his mother with a knife and
took her head and climbed the mountain. God Ra Akhti got furious and sent for a search for Horus to punish him. When Set found him, he pinned him to the ground and took out his eyes and threw them to the ground. In the morning, lily flowers grew out of them.
In this part of the story of the struggle of Horus with his uncle God Set, we can see that Horus arrived safely on the boat which he used in capturing his uncle God Set, arrived and welcomed by goddess Hathor, and also 6 dancers or musicians beating on the drum, celebrating his victory and celebrating that he came back safely to land.
Horus sailed north with his boat to goddess Neith to ask for her help to settle the dispute between them, especially that it lasted 80 years in front of the gods' congregation without a judgment. God Thoth asked Osiris, who decided that the job of ruling must go to his son by inheritance, otherwise he would send evil spirits to terminate the gods. In the end, they all admitted the right of Horus to the position, and Set agreed to pass on the title. Then he was crowned with a white crown and seated on his father's throne to rule all of Egypt. On stage, the situation got more dramatically.
This is actually not the end of the story. The story ends here when we see that God Horus stands over his uncle, God Set, who is the symbol of the evil, standing over him, declaring his victory. And we can see the chains and the ropes, tying the jaws of the hippo together, the jaw together, and the end of the rope and the arrow actually is in the hand of God Horus. Behind him is his mother, goddess Isis, supporting him all the time as she used to do.
After God gave the god of the earth, gave the land to Horus alone, and made him the sole inhabitant of earth, Horus was crowned with both the red and the white crowns, and became a symbol for the union by joining between the lily flower and the papyrus flower symbols of the north and south of Egypt. This symbolic scene is always represented on the sides of the throne in seated royal statues. The Egyptians embodied the victory of Horus over Set in many ways and in more than a scene, including the scenes that picture Horus stabbing the hippo or the crocodile or the pig, which are all symbols of Set. According to the dramatic papyrus of the Ra Museum, the standing of Horus on the back of a boat means that he won over Set, as the boat itself is Set when he carried Osiris. But since we're still watching a play acted on stage, we need a convenient once and for all closure, which paved the way to similar symbolic actions in religions to come.
The play of the struggle between God Horus and his uncle Set started with the ibis bird or God Jehuti reading from a piece of paper saying that the play has started. We are here ending the play with a priest wearing the tiger leather and holding a piece of paper in his hand and reading the end of the story. The story ends with another priest bringing an animal on the stage and slaughtering it as a sacrifice instead of the real god Set, who was captured by God Horus. This is actually a very important mythology in the ancient Egyptian history, the mythology of the struggle between God Horus, who represented good, against his uncle God Set, who represent evilness.